Alrighty then. So I think most of you remember me. I'll kind of stand up for the most part here, so you can all see me in the back. Like I said, I think most of you remember me. If not, I'm Jason Sandys. I'm up for the day from San Antonio. I actually just dropped my wife and kids off at the mall across the street. So if I get some texts here, it's because my credit card's probably getting used. So maybe I better turn that off. So like Greg, I'm a enterprise client management MVP. That pretty much means that we've been doing ConfigMgr for a long time, and now we're trying to do Intune. So anyone doing Intune in here at all? Nobody doing Intune. Anyone doing MDM at all as part of their day-to-day job? A little bit. What are you using to do it? AirWatch? Okay. Nobody else, really? Wow. So that's obviously kind of the big new thing that's coming down the pipe. At least everyone, have you all at least had those discussions internally somewhere? Managing your mobile devices? I see Dustin definitely shaking his head. Nobody else? Everyone wants to stay away from mobile devices?
We're looking at AirWatch too.
You are?
Yeah.
Why?
Our guy
Your guy?
Yeah.
Does he work in this building?
Yeah, he works there.
Good. Can we go beat him up?
I mentioned to him when he was looking at it, and I said, ConfigMgr is, coming along with this. And he's like, yeah, I did all the research, and so somehow there's conclusion.
How long ago? Because Intune changes like every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I don't know, it's like a year ago.
Yeah, it's vastly different. So.
Or if I try to persuade it, all those responsibilities come to our team.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh no.
Well, at the end of the day, it's a single pane of glass, though, right? So, and definitely a little bit of a side discussion. We'll get to this eventually, but it's one of those, I think, more interesting discussions to have now. And what I've mostly been telling folks is whether you want BYO, so you're not going to hear Microsoft say BYO anymore, right? Simply because it is, right? Every device is effectively a BYO now. And so whether you want that in your organization or not, you've got it in your organization. Whether you tried to lock things down or not, there are people bringing phones. There are people bringing, so this is not a Catapult owned, so I work for Catapult Systems, by the way. This is not a Catapult owned device, and yet I do all my work on that. So even in Catapult, we don't have an official policy. It kind of said, no, we don't want you to, but that doesn't matter. We've all kind of done it ourselves because we don't want, a lot of us don't want, we travel a lot. We don't want one of the big Mongo, you've seen the Lenovo 530s and 520s with the 170 watt power brick that weighs like 10 pounds in and of itself. I don't want that. I don't need that, right? And so having that choice, and everybody wants that choice for the most part, right? If you work for Dell, you can probably choose anything out of their models. I don't know, can you?
We wish.
Yeah, you wish. There you go. So, I mean, even the Microsoft guys, right, they can do it. They used to not be able to. They had a short list of stuff they could choose from. But now, if you work for Microsoft, you can go to Best Buy, pick up whatever you want, image it with the corporate image, and you're done. They don't really care anymore, right? So they've opened things up. And that's kind of how it is across the board, whether people are using iPads, that kind of stuff. So that's all managing the device of the end users. And that's all going to be part of that same space. And that's really where the value prop of using ConfigMgr and Intune is, right? So that's why it's a really interesting discussion, and it's something that we're all probably at least kind of have to talk about in the next couple of years. Okay, on to the topic du jour, right? That means of the day, right? Anybody speak French in here? Nobody? No French people?
Did you make sure the recording started?
Yeah, let's make sure. I thought I did. I pushed record. Looks like it's going, right? To me, that looks like it's going.
Yeah.
Good deal.
Very good.
Okay, let me start the presentation again. So the topic of the day is HTTPS. So, yep.
On the recorder, the little dot was gray, not red. You got a little icon.
It was blinking?
It wasn't, I think. On record. Shouldn't it be red?
I pushed it.
No, you pushed that. It's got timers going.
Yeah, okay, cool. No worries. Better safe than sorry. I don't know what I'd really be sorry about, but that's okay. We wouldn't have the recording. So how many of you are doing HTTPS today in your environments? Anyone? You guys are doing it? You guys are doing it? Where are you at? Okay, and you are? Okay. So are you guys doing it explicitly? Are you doing IBCM also on top of it? Or are you just doing HTTPS? That's it? Okay. So we'll get into a slide in a minute, and I'll ask you guys why in a minute, so kind of be noodling that one over if you happen to do it. So quickly, what I'll be talking about. So the whys, the whats, HTTPS. We'll talk about some IBCM stuff for sure. We'll talk a little bit about why in a minute. Like this is here. We're not going to talk about PKI. Now, that's an interesting statement, so keep that one in the back of your head, because I'm not going to talk about those specific things about PKI. But does anyone do PKI internally in their environment? Anyone PKI smart? Would you consider yourself PKI smart? Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Just curious. But you'll see why I say that and why I hedge on saying that we're not going to talk about PKI. Move this over here so I don't have to lean over there. So first off, what is it? It's an evolution of native mode in ConfigMgr 2007. So native mode was exactly what it, not really what it sounds like, but it was a security mode for the clients. I have a handful of small animations in here just to kind of guide things through. But it's about securing the communication between the clients and your client-facing site systems only. So what are those? Our DP, our MP, our SUP, and our SMP. And really it's not the SUP, right, because the client doesn't ever talk to the SUP. The client talks to your WSUS instance. So it's securing it using HTTPS, kind of like the name implies. And it's making sure that, once again, all that traffic is signed so no one can tamper with it. And then it's also encrypted so that no one can actually see what's in there. It's not every single piece of traffic. There are still a couple of things, like notice the FSP is not up here. So FSP traffic is never encrypted or signed. That's totally clear text messaging, which makes sense because if you think about the whole purpose of the FSP, it's so the client can raise a signal with the site that says, I've got issues, right? If he's got issues because he can't talk HTTPS, he would never be able to tell the site, right? You'd get in that nice circular chicken and the egg type scenario where the client would never be able to talk. So the FSP is always unencrypted. There are a couple of other smaller pieces like remote control, right, that the client's not going to talk. But for the most part, a vast majority of the client to site system traffic is secured when we enable HTTPS. Now, unlike native mode in 2007, it's not an all or nothing thing. With 2012, we can have site systems that talk HTTPS, and we can have site systems that talk HTTP. Now, the site systems can't talk both. It's one or the other for the site systems. Once again, those are the 4 big site systems over there. So you have to make sure that you're planning ahead of time if you're going to have clients that talk in both of them, that you're effectively going to have to double your infrastructure. Something to definitely think about for that one. Also, this has nothing to do with site system to site system or site server communication. Right? So the management point talking back to SQL Server, nothing to do with that. The site server talking to a secondary site server talking to any of the other site systems, nothing to do with that. This is strictly for the client to site system, kind of like it's highlighted there at the bottom. Oh yeah, and of course, right, user group rules, anybody questions, whatever, just stop me as we go along. So here's the why. So questions for you guys. So why are you guys doing HTTPS today? Okay, so it is for IBCM then.
Just starting.
Okay, so you implemented it in preparation for rolling out IBCM. Okay, what about you guys?
We're just trying to get ahead of the curve. It's not a requirement anyway, but just wanted to implement it because we feel like it's important to have once we start potentially managing internet-based clients.
Okay.
And just to CTI.
So preparatory, and yeah, so if anyone asks the question, is it secure, you can say yes. Okay, yeah, good reasons, right? So that's really the first reason right here that we have up here is that one. It's just because you have some type of either real or maybe perceived or just preparatory requirements that we want to have that client communication secure. So this was pointed out to me on one of the forums. Somebody sent me a link to some Finnish government documentation, and in their government documentation, which is prescriptive for even private entities within Finland, they were recommending that all private entities enable encryption even for client management traffic. So obviously not specific to ConfigMgr to any system, but they were actually doing that. And if you start looking at the trends today, right, with our wonderful friends there, and are they on Langley? It's not Langley, is it? No, Langley's the CIA, wherever the NSA is, right, wherever those guys are at. Yeah, that's true. That's very true, right? They're virtually and probably physically everywhere, right? Are you with the NSA? No. Yeah, so that's definitely the new trend, right? Is those guys have their hands in everything, and just being able to protect it from them, and maybe not so much them, but right, you've seen the Sony stuff this week. That's kind of really scary, and I think they're right now kind of blaming it on North Koreans or maybe an inside job. I've seen different theories floating around. I don't think there's anything definitive, I haven't read the news in the last day and a half, so I don't know if there's anything definitive out there right now. But that's all management traffic at the end of the day. And if it's something that in and of itself, do we really care that our software inventory, our hardware inventory, our IP addresses in that? Not explicitly, but if you talk to some of the pen testers out there, those are all clues that they can use. They're all breadcrumbs that they can follow, that they can exploit to then lead to the actual breaches where they're actually getting real data. And it's not just state-sponsored, right? So the North Korea would potentially be state-sponsored. The Russian mob's huge right now, as far as a lot of the malware that's out there. You've seen the encryption ones that lock your computer until you call and pay. I mean, that's all Russian mob. That's all those folks that are doing that kind of stuff. So making their job harder is really what security is about at the end of the day, and so that's a good reason to do it. And the other one, the internet-based client management, right? So that's essentially a prerequisite. If we're going to do IBCM, then we have to enable HTTPS, right? We want to go across the internet. We always want to make sure stuff going across the internet is secure, even though our email is not. But that's a whole side discussion. OS 10. Anyone, unfortunately, managing OS 10? You reluctantly raised your hand.
Two.
You got just 2 systems? Is that what you said, or
Yeah,
okay?
it's just the pain.
Is it?
User client.
Do you have a huge population of OS 10 that are university owned?
We are just libraries.
Okay.
We have a small.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it works fairly well. Chris and Peter have talked about that. So you can actually, if you don't know, you can actually manage OS 10 with ConfigMgr. It's going to give you the basic information, hardware, software inventory. You can do software distribution. So it works.
Yeah, they're always at least an OS revision behind. They can't keep up with Apple's
Right.
OSs. So.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly right, and that's kind of one of the things they're having to face on the MDM side. Now, on the MDM side with Intune, they can keep up a lot faster since that's a cloud service. It's actually one of the challenges they have with vNext. We actually spent a fair amount of time in discussion on that one when we were up in Redmond, and it's something they're trying to figure out because it's not only Apple at that point, but now they've got to keep up with Android, they've got to keep up with Samsung Knox, they've got to keep up with the Windows Phone group, which is essentially now merged into the Windows group, but they're still going to have different release schedules, right? They're still going to have different feature sets. So how do we keep up with all these different vendors now? We couldn't even keep up with our internal stuff before, now we got to keep up with other different vendors. So yeah, you're right, it's definitely somewhat of a challenge. I know, and there's even a complicating factor on the OS 10 side. So there's a SCEP client, so System Center Endpoint Protection, for OS 10. It's not actually made by Microsoft. It's OEM. I think it's Kaspersky that they OEM to put on OS 10 and Linux for that matter, because Microsoft doesn't want to really make products for those computers at this point in time. It won't make them any money, but they have to be able to fill that checkbox, right? So.
It's still standalone.
Yep, because it's an OEM product copy of that, right? So there's no management of it. Which on the OS 10 side and Linux side, they're not huge targets in general, but it's still nice to have it on there in a corporate environment, right? And the last is if you happen to be doing any legacy MDM, right? Anyone ever do any legacy MDM? So Windows Phone Windows Mobile 6.5, Symbian, what else is in there? Windows CE, of course. So it's possible, but that would be the only other reason. So the interesting thing here, though, is that OS 10 support is actually built on top of the legacy mobile support, so that's why that's actually required. So those are all the reasons. The top 2 are probably what most people are actually going to do. Now, if you do have just a strict security requirement, there is another checkbox in the console, and I'll show you guys that in a little bit, that will secure, without having any PKI, without having any HTTPS involved, will actually secure some of your client communication. But it's only a small portion. So if you have that bigger security requirement, this is definitely the way to go. All right, so this is the big what's needed, and it's a trusted PKI, certificate authority. So this could be a public CA. This could be a CA that someone else in your company has already stood up, or your organization has already stood up. Or it could be a CA that you stand up for the specific purpose of supporting ConfigMgr. The big key here, though, is that highlighted where it has to be trusted. So trust for PKI has nothing to do with Active Directory, right? So that's a common misperception. You'll see a lot of people ask questions around, okay, well, I have this PKI in this domain. There's no such thing as a PKI being in an Active Directory domain. Yes, it can be directly supported by that domain and can be enabled, or the domain can be an enabler for pushing those certificates out. But at the end of the day, the domain is not a boundary in any way, or a forex is not a boundary in any way for a PKI. To be trusted, we just have to have that certificate in the Trusted Root Certificate Authorities store on the client system. And we'll look at that in a second also. So what do you actually need? And this is the big one right here. You need a unique client auth cert for each and every client. So that kind of rules out typically using a public CA. You're not going to want to go to VeriSign and pick a number, whatever number you want to pick out. $100 per certificate per year, even if you only have 100 clients, right? That adds up real quick every year. So if you got 100 clients, you probably don't want a 10K bill every year from VeriSign to renew all your certificates, let alone actually getting those certificates to each and every one of your different systems. And most people, even though you guys are small, you probably have more than 100 clients, right? And because you probably don't want to have that $10,000 bill coming from VeriSign every year and then putting those certs out there. So that's really kind of the big stumbling block for most people. So you almost have to have an internal PKI to be able to do this in a cost-effective manner and in a manner that makes it easy to get that certificate out to each and every one of your clients. Now, like I said, having an Active Directory integrated certificate authority makes that a lot easier also, because now you don't have that challenge of actually issuing those certificates to each and every one of those clients. It's something that Active Directory will do for you automatically. It's called auto-enrollment. And then there's auto-renewal. That's what it is. So you don't have to worry about that. If that certificate expires, or really there's a grace period or a period before it expires, where AD will renew that certificate in place. 6 weeks is the default with an enterprise PKI. So those are great things. You could, if you happen to have, let's say, an RSA PKI internal, you could absolutely use that. Once again, as long as it's trusted, ConfigMgr doesn't care the source of a certificate. Certificate is a certificate is a certificate. Now, how you manage that PKI, how you issue the certificates, how you do the renewal, those are all undefined tasks as far as ConfigMgr goes, right? Or really as far as Microsoft goes. They're not going to tell you how to do that in an RSA or third-party PKI infrastructure. You're going to have to go figure that one out for yourself. But if you're using a Microsoft CA, there's pretty good documentation on how to get all of this done. However, at the same time, that generic sample documentation, as we all know from implementing anything, is just that. It's generic sample documentation, right? You need to figure out how that works and fits into your organization and how it's going to be best in your organization. So what else do we need? We need server auth certificates. That one's a little bit easier. We could use public ones there if we want. Or of course, we already have our PKI stood up. That's probably the best place to issue those. That's going to be for each one of those client-facing systems, site servers or site systems, that is hosting a client-facing role, the MP, the DP, the SUP, and whatever other one that I'm missing, the SMP, I guess. That one's pretty easy. Now the asterisk here is for the MP. The MP also needs a client auth cert. And the reason it does that, if you've ever opened, I think it's MP control log, you'll notice that there's a check that runs every hour, that the MP itself makes sure that the MP website is available. Well, if that MP is listening HTTPS, and it doesn't have a client auth cert to authenticate to the website at that point in time, you're going to get an error in MP control because the MP monitor at that point can't check it because it can't talk what the MP is expecting. Not a big deal. Doesn't mean the MP is not working, but it means you're going to get that error every hour. So that time, it of course needs the client auth cert. And of course, if you're going to be managing those site systems as HTTPS clients, they will need client auth certs also, right? So the servers can be two-role or two-faced, if you will, at that point. There'll be clients as well as servers. So of course, you need a client auth cert then. Back up real quick onto that one. That client or the site server certificate, every now and then, you'll come in and IIS will unbind it. We'll talk about the IIS bindings. I should have time to show it real quick. You'll come in on Monday morning, and nothing will be working. You'll look around, you notice your MP is not working, your MP control log's throwing all kinds of errors. You finally go check IIS, and the certificate's magically unbound in IIS. I've heard some people say that it's because of certain software updates will do this to you. So it's just something to go and check. It's kind of one of those odd things. As we're all probably familiar with managing ConfigMgr, those of us that do ConfigMgr day to day, there's a lot of external dependencies. Sometimes those dependencies do odd things, so we always have to go make sure we check those things again when things break. Okay, so the last certificate type that we have is actually for our boot media, so our boot images themselves. In the console, a lot of people will call these the DP certs. So any of you who've pushed out a DP or created a DP in 2012 will notice at the bottom of the one page there's actually a certificate area. So people call those the DP certs since it's configured on the DP. That cert has nothing to do with the DP. That cert is something that's actually pushed to our OSD clients, so any of the clients that start running a task sequence, so that they can then in turn communicate back with the site. Even if that site's not listening in HTTPS, we need that certificate because there are still client certificates being used behind the scenes. And so when we create boot media, we have to supply a certificate also so that it's embedded in the media so that can be delivered to the client so it can establish the connection or really authenticate to the site at that point in time. So I hate it when people call it a DP cert because it has nothing to do with the DP itself. It's something that Pixie is actually delivering. But that's effectively just another client auth cert that gets used over and over and over and over again on the client during the task sequence. Yep, and that's the really important point. So let's hop into my lab here real quick, simply because I've mentioned it a few times, and we'll look at a few of those things. Any questions at this point? Go ahead.
So when you put that certificate on the DP,
Uh-huh.
which is not a search,
Yep.
and you Pixie boot,
Yep.
it transmits that certificate to that one client,
Yep.
or does it get embedded in the boot media?
If you create boot media itself, you will embed one in that boot media. If you're coming from
Manually?
Pixie, so let's go down. Well, let me show you in the DP first, which was where I just was. So we can see here it's on the general tab. And in this case, even though this is an HTTPS MP, I just don't do any OSD off of it. You can see we have our create self-signed certificate right there. Right, this whole little section right here. And in this case, it's creating the self-signed one. Or we would import one in, and this would just be nothing more than a client auth certificate that we would import in. So during Pixie boot, the boot image would get delivered, and that same process that also delivers our tsvariables.dat will deliver this certificate down. Then that client can use it, because right, we're in Windows PE. It's not part of the domain. It has no identity or authentication on the network. And all clients have a self-signed certificate, even if we're doing HTTP. Right? If we're just doing normal, standard, what most people do HTTP, there's still two self-signed certificates, and we'll look at those in a second. But in Windows PE, there's no way for those clients to have that at that time, and they won't self-generate them. So this is a certificate that gets delivered during the Pixie process so that it can identify itself and work just during OSD. And it will use that all the way until the final task of OSD is complete. Now, if we're doing HTTPS, hopefully it's got a new certificate at the end of that, and typically group policy will deliver that for you. So let's go look at when we create the media. If I click on the right thing. So let's see here, create task sequence media. We will create our bootable media. Site-based is always best. I will pick my random folder here because we're not going to end up creating it. And it's effectively the same. All right, it's effectively the exact same options that we just had there for the DP itself. And the same thing, except it does get explicitly embedded in this ISO when I create it, or on the USB key when I create it from this wizard, whichever you're doing. In this case, it was an ISO.
Just curious why they wouldn't put that in the boot image properties instead.
Yeah, because it's not formally part of the boot image itself. It's part of what gets booted. So yeah, I guess they're just trying to create a small separation is really what it comes down to. So yeah, it'd be an interesting question to ask. I'm sure there were certain reasons for that one. It allows Pixie to be a lot more dynamic. So, Pixie will serve up whatever you want on the fly, right? Just like Pixie normally does, and has the advantages there. Whereas boot media, once you create it, it's fire and forget. So one thing you can do, right, I can expire that certificate. So we've all probably seen this node, or maybe you've probably seen it and never taken notice of it, if I can actually find it, because I don't remember where it is. Is it under security? Yeah, there we go. Is this certificates node. And those are all the self-signed certificates. Well, actually, they're all the certificates that ConfigMgr knows about, just like the different accounts. And I can actually come in here. And that one looks like it's blocked. Yeah, no, that one's blocked because it got replaced at some point in time. Right, and one of the things when we're using certificates is we want to be able to have control of them after we issue them. And one of the ways we can do that is to block them. And so if I block that certificate now, if I know which media that's on, granted that's going to be kind of hard from this interface specifically, you're not going to know which media it's on, but if I block that, now that media can no longer be used. So there's a way to control that media now too once it goes out. Right. On the Pixie side, if we do that, now our Pixie's toast. So there's definitely a reason to have a distinction between the two and decouple it from the WIM itself, or our boot image itself. That's a good question, though. I hadn't really thought of that one explicitly before. Okay, so let's go to our site servers here and our site systems. So my one and only site. I think I have a slide somewhere later on down the line on what you have to do, but we'll cover that here real quick since I'm in my lab.
Hey, Jason.
Yep.
And maybe I missed this.
Please.
Back when you were creating boot media,
Yep.
you go to import it, was it pulling directly out of the ConfigMgr infrastructure, or did you have to point it to a local file?
If you're going to create, or if you're going to use an existing one, then you're going to use a local file, or it'll create a new one on the fly, a new self-signed one on the fly.
Well, yeah, it'll do that one by default, but if you're going to leverage the import function, you actually have to have that
It's a file,
sitting
correct.
local.
And yep, and it has to have the private key in there, right? So the private key is exactly that. It's a key that only the entity that's going to use that certificate ever is going to have. So that certificate is going to be password protected. So there was a password field on there too, so you can type the password in. So it's always a PFX or one of the other formats where you can store the private key in there.
Make sure we export the certificate.
Yeah.
You export it with the private key.
Yeah, so you have to, yeah, and so what Donnie said is when you export the certificate, you have to make sure the private key is in that export. So the other kind of precursor to that even is you have to create the certificate somewhere, right? ConfigMgr is not going to make that certificate request for you for one from your PKI infrastructure. You've got to go into one of your clients. You can do it on the DP. You can do it really anywhere and create one from a template that has the checkbox that says allow private key to be exportable because that's not default. So
That's a pain.
it can be, particularly if you've forgotten about it and you don't really know the details.
So we have our technicians create their own boot media.
Yep.
Primarily because if you create an ISO, it doesn't include the UEFI bootloader.
Right.
And they can't image devices like the one you have
Right.
there unless they have Pixie.
Yep.
If you're on an older server infrastructure, 2008 R2, UEFI Pixie boot is basically useless.
Yep.
So
Yeah, so there's
that
definitely,
causes some issues.
yeah, there's definitely a lot of, and these are starting to get into some of those PKI weeds that I was kind of alluding to. We won't get into a whole lot. And I'll mention that again at the end, but I don't have an issue talking about some of it. So here's my certificate authority. It is an enterprise certificate authority, and I think it's on a slower VM, so it may take a while. We'll come back to it as soon as it decides to connect, besides getting the black screen. But when we create templates in the Microsoft PKI, one of the things in there, and it's a choice, it's not on by default, it says mark this key as exportable. Because typically you don't want the private key to go anywhere. It's private for a reason. If that private key falls into the wrong hands, then that key pair is effectively compromised and you don't have any security left with that key pair. So let's see. I don't know what's wrong with it. Like I said, it's a slower VM. It may eventually come up. We'll come back to it in a minute. So on the site server itself, we really just have a couple of things to configure. We have the client communications tab. Notice we have our HTTPS only. That's the default mode. If y'all remember going through setup in the lab or in production or whenever you've done it, it'd actually be in HTTPS only by default. The reason for that is because Microsoft likes to ship things set in the most secure mode possible out of the box. It doesn't mean they necessarily recommend you do it, which is what a lot of people kind of mistake that for. It's just they are trying to force you into the most secure method possible. But at the end of the day, there's no difference technically or functionality-wise between the two. So in this case, I do have a mixed site, so I actually did change it when I did the installation. But if I wanted to do HTTPS only, obviously I would check that. In the middle, we have our use PKI client certificate. So this is effectively telling the clients, hey, yeah, if you have a client auth certificate available, go ahead and use HTTPS by default and don't use HTTP. Oops, that's not what I wanted. It's possible for a client to have multiple client auth certificates. So we can put some criteria in here to tell it, oh, yep, this is what we want, and this is which certificate we actually want to prefer. At the end of the day, it actually doesn't matter which client auth certificate it uses, as long as the client trusts it. And remember, it's sending it over to the site systems, so the site systems have to trust it also. It's a piece that a lot of people forget. It's two things that are actually checking to make sure that the client auth certificate is actually there and available. And the big reason for that is this last checkbox here. We'll talk about a lot more on that one on a slide down the line, but it's for the certificate revocation check-in, which is similar to blocking a certificate. Actually, it is blocking a certificate, just done it a little bit of a different way. And the last one down here is really kind of an ambiguous option. It says, hey, what are your trusted root certs? This only goes back to operating system deployment. So similar, right? Our Windows PE system and our system that's getting loaded during our task sequence doesn't know what certificate authorities to trust. This is how it'll know. So in addition to sending that self-signed certificate down in our HTTP environment, in our HTTPS environment, it'll send our PKI certificate down. But it doesn't know to trust that. This will add it to that system being imaged, its trusted root certificate authorities. Otherwise, there's no way for it to know that that's going to be trusted.
Jason, where do these checks happen? Is it once Windows PE is fully loaded and you're kind of at the password prompt, or
checks for
that actually does the certificate check?
Okay, yeah, and that all has to do with the certificate revocation list. Effectively, it's not really ConfigMgr that's doing that. It's the operating system itself that's doing that. So by default, every application, when it uses a certificate, is supposed to check that certificate's certificate revocation list. So just like it sounds like, the revocation list is a list of certificates issued from a certificate authority that are no longer good, that are blocked, right, by that certificate authority. And that's the way, kind of the example would be, and this is one of the examples I've used, if I give a key to Dustin, a physical key to my house to Dustin, then unless, Dustin can always obviously go out to Home Depot and have that key copied, not too hard. But at that point, I can send the cops after Dustin, right, or I can go hire, Joe on the corner to go beat up Dustin, whatever, to get that key back. I have some physical recourse to go get that key back from him. In a digital world, if I give Dustin a certificate or some media that's a key effectively, because that's what a certificate is, anyone can copy that certificate now, and he can send it out, and there's no way I can ever get that back. So that in a certificate revocation list is a list of those certificates that I don't want anyone to ever use again and to have the ability to use again. So that's what the CRIL is. So every time an application uses a certificate, within the certificate itself, there is, and let's actually go look at one while I'm talking about that. Let me open up my MMC here. So we can see all of our certificates that are on a system. Actually, you know what? That system doesn't have one. This one does. So within the certificate itself is a list of CDPs, so certificate revocation list distribution points, or CRIL DPs. Not to be confused with configuration manager DPs. Totally different concept, but still like named. So I'm going to add certificates for my computer account. And I'm going to go to the personal store, and you can see, I'll zoom in on this one, intended purpose, client auth, just like we were talking about. But let's go ahead and look at the certificate itself. That's not what I wanted. I'm going to open it. Get rid of the background noise. Oh, I can't do it. And we go down to right here, CRIL distribution points. And notice there's a nice big list down here at the bottom. It's a URL for me, and that's off of my CA. So it's just an HTTP location. It's really just a file. Notice the file name. I don't know why I'm pointing up there instead of doing this. Let's see here. This right here, all the way to here, it's just a file name. It's just a file getting served up by a web server. It doesn't really matter what the web server is. We don't care where it's coming from. Because if I typed in that URL explicitly, I would get the CRIL back, which is just really a text file that Windows, of course, knows how to interpret. And it's just a bunch of IDs in there, certificate IDs that are in there. And based upon that, if my ID or the ID of the certificate that I'm looking at is in that certificate revocation list, the application at that point is supposed to halt and say, nope, I'm not going to use this whatsoever. So it's a way of blocking it at the end of the day. Now, an application doesn't explicitly have to check for crills. So that was that checkbox. If we go back to my site, I don't think I have properties open still. So that was that checkbox right here, right? Clients check the certificate revocation list. It's actually optional for a client or an application, really, to check the certificate revocation list. If you're not checking the certificate revocation list, I have really no way of controlling, once I issue a certificate, who's actually using it or if it can be used. So in the strictest sense, your security is probably lowered. Your security posture is probably lowered at that point, right? Because you have no way to control that. If you're simply using your PKI as a means to an end, so in our case, potentially just enabling IBCM, is that such a big deal? Maybe not. Just really depends upon what you're doing, but it is up to the application to ultimately check. And so that's a decision for everyone to make. There's a couple of reasons to potentially turn that off, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Does that answer? Or you got any?
Part of it. So
Okay.
We are working on an implementation of 802.1x
Okay.
authentication. We pretty much told our security and networking teams that they can't block Pixie.
All right.
For obvious reasons.
Yep.
We like being able to provision systems for everybody else.
Yep.
So I guess my question is, like, during the actual boot up process, you know, the certificate's embedded in the boot image when it creates, et cetera, it starts booting them.
Yep.
But we actually do an automatic authentication during Windows PD startup
All right.
to the 802.1x auth portal. So that basically we don't have to.
Yeah, it's just basically radius or
Yeah,
TACX.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is there going to be an issue with you know, checking the grills and that kind of stuff before that happens? Does it happen afterward?
So it depends. So if you're using radius, what kind of authentication are you using with the radius?
It's actually Cisco IC.
Right, but are you using like PEEP? Are you using certificate-based authentication?
Oh well, we leverage certificate, but for this process, we're actually leveraging user-based auth.
Okay.
So we've got a service account that we.
Okay, so at that point, the cert's not
automatic.
coming into it. So
Okay.
it could hinder you if it can't get to the krill for sure, right? If you don't have that.
Yeah, exactly.
So you have to make sure that that path is open and bypasses the authentication mechanism. So yeah, it could if you have the krill in there for sure. If you're not doing any krill checking, to use a certificate requires no network activity whatsoever, because all it has to do is check to make sure that it's trusted, and that's our trusted root certification authorities. Actually, in my case, no, it is right here. So there is the certificate from my certificate authority, which means any certificates that this certificate authority issues are going to be trusted. End of story. There's nothing else to check off box.
And you said that checkbox was strictly for OSD.
The krill checking, no, it's for all
That's
client
for all,
activity. Yeah,
no.
it's either on or off. There's no just for OSD or not. The part that was just for OSD was the very bottom,
Yes.
and that's to make it so the OSD client during the task sequence actually trusts that certificate authority and thus all the certificates that that certificate authority is issued. Okay, good. So the other small piece that I mentioned is if you want just some limited amount of security, that's this last tab that kind of gets forgotten, the signing and encryption tab on our site itself. So we can sign our traffic, right? So signing anything just means that people can look at it. We're not protecting the content itself, but we're making sure that no one can tamper with it. We'll figure out if someone has actually tampered with it. And we can also verify the source. So we can make sure, once again, that's kind of an anti-tampering, right? If it's coming from some random place, we don't want it either. Then we can kick that up to requiring SHA-256, because by default now SHA-1 is pretty easily crackable by NSA and other entities. I think NSA can pretty much crack anything. It's when the other entities can crack things when things become vulnerable or on the bad list. And then we can finally use triple DAS to encrypt some of the communication. And notice here it says just client inventory and state messages, so it's not everything, which may or may not be sufficient. It really just depends upon what your goals are for implementing that security piece. But nothing extra. You don't need the PKI to do all of this. So it could be a quick and easy way of filling that security checkbox that your security guys come screaming down the hall for, every other day, as a lot of them ultimately do. So for our site systems, I actually have my lab in a hybrid mode. I have two different site systems. I have CM1, which is actually my site server also, and I have CM2, which is serving up HTTPS for my client-facing roles. So I only have the management point and the distribution point loaded. So if we go to my management point, to reinforce one thing I said earlier, it was HTTP or HTTPS, right? I can't do both of these, the radio buttons. So if I'm going to support both, like in my lab, I have to have one of each. I'm doubling my infrastructure effectively. So if you're just going to support Macs in your environment and you want to just do that, there is some pain involved with the PKI. So pushing that certificate out to all those clients may be painful, but you're going to have two management points at that point in time so you can support this. So that's a choice you're making. It's a trade-off effectively. Which kind of lesser evil do you want to pick? Now we also have this drop-down here, allow intranet or intranet connections only, kind of an odd drop-down because it only has one option. The reason I only have one option in there, and I haven't filled it in, if I go back to my site system, and I actually fill in an FQDN on this box right here, then I will actually get two more options in that dropdown. And of course, this will be to support IBCM, which I don't have set up in my lab. At that point, this dropdown will contain two more options. Like I said, the one will be allow intranet and internet connections, and then one will be allow only internet connections, right? So we can make that choice also. So once again, potentially adding more management points to my environment depending upon the goals of implementing HTTPS. And then our mobile devices and Mac computers, because once again, that's effectively the same thing for ConfigMgr. So that's really it on the management point itself. Same with the distribution point. We're going to get exactly that same option. All right, we have our HTTP and HTTPS and that exact same drop-down. There's really nothing else to do on those systems. Software update point has the same option, although we have to go into WSUS and do a few things in IIS to actually configure WSUS to listen on HTTPS. Those are documented out there. I think Justin Chalfant, he's a PFE for Microsoft, just put that out there because it's kind of hard to find in the actual TechNet documentation. So that's something easy to find off of the blogs out there for that, though. At that point, it's done. You don't have to do anything else on ConfigMgr, assuming you have all your PKI set up, right? PKI is still the biggest piece here. Now, one thing I did mention before, oh, I don't have it up. Let me go actually pull that guy up. Where are you? We'll see if he connects. Ooh, there's my CA finally. Here's my certificate authority. That might take a little while to launch. So this is my second site system. I'm actually going to launch IIS. He's not the swiftest VM either. And I'll show you that you have to bind the server auth certificate in IIS. Nothing spectacular. If you've done any IIS work, this isn't a big piece. But it is something that you have to do before you actually flip the site system to HTTPS. So we'll go to my default website. Notice I have all my normal folders, my virtual directories there. I'll go to bindings. I have my binding in here for 443, HTTPS, and there's my SSL certificate at the bottom. Oh, I don't have Zoom it. Crap, no Zoom it. It's on the desktop, I bet. Nope, it's not. You guys can see that, right? Sorry, I wasn't expecting to show this guy. But effectively, you're choosing a certificate that got issued to this client. And that's the thing, every now and then you'll just come in, and like I said, I've heard people say that it's because of software updates. You'll come in and it's gone. You just have to come back in here, re-enable it, and everything just magically starts working again. So always make sure those core things are working. Okay, on the CA, back to the private key piece, we'll look at one of my templates here. Which template? We will choose, not that one. Goodness, which ones do I even have? Internal workstation, that's what I called it. There we go. Not help. I hate that that's even in there. There should be like a global option. Get rid of help off of all the context menus. Where are you? Here we go. On the request handling, I don't have Zoom in on here either, but there is a checkbox, and this is not enabled by default. Allow private key to be exported. If I don't set that, which I don't have on my normal certificate right here, actually it's this guy right here, and I go to export this, Notice that dialog right there. The yes, totally grayed out. I can't even choose it because this certificate was created from a template that didn't have that checkbox checked. So that's the immediate way to know, hey, I got to go create a new template within my Microsoft PKI. Kind of like I said before, if you're using an RSA PKI or you're using some other PKI, I have no idea how you get that done, right? This is totally undefined to me. I'm sure it's defined to somebody, but not anyone in the Microsoft world on actually how to get that done. So not that it's not possible, but you're not going to find any documentation from any core Microsoft folks on how to do that piece. Okay, cancel a couple dialog boxes and hop back over to the site server itself. And I think that's about all I'll show on that for right now. Any questions on any of this stuff? I clicked through everything okay? Nobody got lost? Yep.
How does the krill list get updated? The one where
Yep. So, go back here on my CA. Let me do this real quick. Let me copy over, zoom it from somebody who has it, so we have it. Thank God, zoom it small. So effectively, it's just a setting on the Microsoft PKI itself. So if we come in here to the Extensions tab, these are the different locations that get embedded in the certificate authority, or into the certificates itself. So you can see my first one is HTTP, my second one is a file location, and the third one is in LDAP. That's actually not default. I'll talk about that in a little while, why I changed that and why I recommend everyone should change that. But notice we also have these options down here at the bottom. And here's this one right here, publish krills to this location. Now I have the HTTP one highlighted, so that box is grayed out. But if I check this second one, notice all of a sudden that box becomes available. And of course for that it's checked. So it's telling the CA when it generates the krill, go ahead and put it in that location. That location happens to also be the same location that my web server is pointing to on the back end, that IIS itself is pointing to on the back end. But we could use something like PowerShell or any other methodology, robocopy, to copy that to our IIS server. It's just a simple file at the end of the day. So pretty easy to do. It's nice that the CA will do it for us if our infrastructure allows us to do that. But since it's just a file, pretty easy to copy over wherever we want to copy over as long as it's available. There's also a concept of delta krills. So if you're a large certificate authority like VeriSign or someone like that, obviously you're probably going to be revoking certificates constantly. Internally, you probably are never going to do this. So if you're doing a lot of them, that certificate revocation list can get really big. That's where delta krills come in, because then you don't have to push out that one big file all the time. Very few people are ever going to need that for an internal PKI. I have it enabled because it's enabled by default just to have it. It doesn't hurt necessarily to have it, but there's almost no reason to have it for any internal PKIs. And that's just something that it does based upon the values when you install the certificate authority. I don't think that those are actually exposed in the UI anywhere. It's based upon the longevity of that krill, so they all time out after a while. I don't remember the values offhand. I think it's every 7 days, but I don't remember the default values. And that's when it'll actually publish that updated one. And that's also the clients. It's a time to live on the krill itself. The clients will cache the krill for the time to live value. And then once that time to live value has elapsed, it will go out and download it again. And then there's grace periods, there's overlapping periods. And this is why PKI starts getting a little more involved, because if you haven't planned a lot of these things out, you can get into times when if you can't get to the krill, once again, the application is going to say, nope, I'm not going to use that certificate anymore. Just like if the host name doesn't match, right? And you get those nice red errors in IE, right? That's the same thing that's happening. But in ConfigMgr, there's nowhere to say, yep, I still want to use that application or that certificate, whereas IE allows you to. Or in Firefox, right, you got to go and explicitly add it to your exclusions list. So they're even making you jump through even more hoops. Or now, if you've seen Chrome, right, so all the SHA-1 certificates that are out there, Chrome is actually going to start blocking those, right? Because the SHA-1 certificates are totally insecure. One of those latest vulnerabilities, I don't remember which one came out. So they're going to start blocking them explicitly. So lots of fun with certificates. Does that answer that for you? Good? Okay. Okay. More slideware and a few little transitions or a few little animations that we have in here. Pretty simple, right? Our normal, what everyone has. Obviously, these roles can be split up on multiple site systems. Go ahead and stand up again. We can do this, right? We can add HTTPS across the board. We can do this, or we have the hybrid, just like my lab was. Now, our clients that have the client auth certificate, they can fall back, right? If for whatever reason that site system is not available. But of course, it won't work the other way. They have to be able to talk HTTPS, which means they have to have a client auth cert. In this case, they don't, so they won't be able to talk back. Nothing gee whiz about that. So there's some redundancy. At least half of my environment, or whatever percentage is capable of using HTTPS. There is some high availability available to them, but all of our non-HTTPS clients won't have that. So probably not something you want to count on or necessarily design for. So we talked a little bit about this one already, the steps to implement. PKI, woohoo, deploy our site certificates and our client certificates. Now, one piece I didn't mention explicitly is for the client certs themselves. So great if our clients are highly connected and are members of our Active Directory, because if we're using an enterprise Microsoft PKI, because it can do it all for us. But if those clients are or belong to road warriors, or if those clients just don't come into the office or are workgroup clients, then Active Directory at that point is not going to help us, right? Because they're not connecting back. So you've got to figure out some other method of getting a certificate to those clients. What that method is another one of those undefined gray areas. You can do some creative scripting. There's a handful of folks who've done some creative scripting out on the web. There's something Microsoft will probably never do, because there's obviously a security aspect to that you can't really guarantee when you're just putting your certificates out on a share somewhere, or allowing people to do that kind of stuff, or assuming that people are going to have local admin permissions too, right? So those are all kind of bad things in general that sometimes the road warriors have, but we can't count on those things, and that's why Microsoft in general is never going to provide a good way to do that. So. I've heard a couple of customers I've been at, they were actually going to use like BombGar, because they had BombGar in place already. So BombGar is a remote control appliance, and they only had about 300 folks they thought were road warriors, and they were just going to remote into each one of them, do a run as, get the certificate and install it, and then install the ConfigMgr client too, because that's kind of another one of those undefined, right, chicken and the egg type things. If the ConfigMgr client's not on it and that system never comes into the office, how do I get the ConfigMgr client on it? Particularly if they're not local admins. If they're local admins, I just send them CCM setup with the command line. But if they're not local admins, now what do? You're not going to be able to do that. So you've got to come up with some creative ways. Maybe if they're sales folks and you have your yearly sales meeting, I've heard of folks do that. So all the sales folks come in the line and you steal their laptop from them and they get it back a day later. Probably none of them are going to be happy about that, because they don't want to pay attention to their meetings and they can't surf the web at that point in time. But that's their problem, not yours. Our roles, kind of like we just looked at, making sure that that's there. Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to point out that if you haven't already set up PKI, you can also look at setting up PKI web services, which basically allows for internet distribution requests of the PKI certificates.
Yeah.
It's difficult to convert if you already have it set up. Not a problem. It's a lot easier if you don't.
Yeah, so it's part of the Microsoft PKI. Effectively, you can set up a web page, a web portal for folks to get in and issue certificates. Part of the challenge there, though, is ConfigMgr is using a local system certificate. So if they're not local admins, they're not getting that in there. So you've still got those chicken and the egg type things. So there are ways to potentially get it done with some scripting, but none of those are inherently secure, and that's really what it comes down to. So it's not that you can't get it done. There's nothing built in that's going to make it happen for you, though. Configure our site. We saw that, all those site properties. And then the last one, test. And this isn't just a one-time test, right? Because no one's necessarily going to call you, right, 5 months down the line, say, I'm not getting my software updates. I don't think you've ever heard a sales guy call and complain because he's not getting his software updates, right? So you're not really ever going to know. Now, your reports are going to go down, and if your bonuses are based upon your compliance, then maybe your bonus is going to get missed, and you're maybe going to go, be motivated. But a lot of people's bonuses aren't. They're just like, whatever, we don't care. And if it's a small percentage, you may never even notice that even in your compliance numbers. So, make sure you put it on your machine, a test machine, or some laptop that you take home every now and then and go test it. Make sure you're actually verifying that the firewall team hasn't closed the ports on you. That's right. We haven't looked at architecture yet, but you're putting systems out in the DMZ. There's traffic coming in IBCM-wise from the outside. So you've got to make sure that those firewall ports are open, that the traffic's actually passing, that your CRILs are being updated, all those other dependency pieces, right, that have nothing to do with ConfigMgr at the end of the day. You've got to make sure that those things are all still in place. So keep testing. So probably the most insecure. Anyone have an architecture like this? I do at home, but that's why I'm raising my hand. So hopefully no one does, but this would be really insecure, right? But this is effectively what you could do. Just allow traffic in from your firewall, map the ports through. And really when we talk about the ports here, for clients, we're talking port 80 or 443, right? 80 is the HTTP, 443 is our HTTPS, so this is going to be 443. We're talking 8531, most likely for WSUS, although that can be 443. So depending upon how Nazi-ish your firewall folks are, you might want to shift your WSUS back over to 443. That way you're only allowing that one single port through, although it's 8531 by default in Server 2012 R2. And then there's another port now, 10123. Everyone know what that one is for client notification? So client notification was a piece they added in SP1 that opens a persistent channel between the client and the management point. It gets renewed every 15 minutes, and it allows the management point to send a signal down to the client to tell the client, hey, you need to go download your policy or run a skep scan. Has everyone seen that? You guys shown that one in here before? Okay, so that's 10123. It will fall back to either 80 or 443 depending upon when the client is talking. But if it does that, it actually requires more memory on the management point. So maybe not such a good thing. And if you can get 10123 open, it's a good thing. Okay, so this would be the more secure if you didn't happen to have a DMZ reverse proxy. Of course, do we all know the dilemma here? There's no more Microsoft reverse proxy, right? TMG is an end-of-life product effectively. I don't even think you can buy TMG anymore. It's still supported until 2021, I think. I think that's the time, but you can't actually buy it anymore. It's no longer on the Microsoft pricing list. So this would have to be some third-party reverse proxy today if you happen to have to go out and buy a new one. So F5 makes one, right? Citrix, Nextscalers, not Citrix, yeah, Citrix and Cisco has reverse proxies, of course. So you're gonna have to go and figure someone else out. If you have TMG in-house still, or you have an EA and you have that available to you, still a great product, but in a few years you're gonna have to figure out something new anyway. So you may as well go with something new right now if you're gonna do that. And really, there's two modes for reverse proxy. So the previous slide was pass-through, which is really not doing a whole lot at that point in time, or bridging. Right, bridging is where the SSL connection is actually terminated at the proxy itself. So now it can actually inspect the traffic, and then it's setting up another HTTP channel to the internal sites. So the pass-through is kind of like what a firewall does, right? There's no real inspection. It's the actual traffic. So if that traffic happens to have something malicious embedded in it, you'll never see it. At the end of the day, really, our security for anything that's exposed to the internet is about securing the endpoint, right? The firewall, it's not really a barrier anymore, right? If someone wants to hack you, they're not going to go through your firewall, or they're going to get through in a lot of different ways. So that's not so much the barrier anymore. But if you can stop the traffic, inspect it before you send it on, that's exactly the value proposition for a reverse proxy. So here's what most people have. They have some type of DMZ, right? This is more of a logical configuration, but it's really what folks have. So in this case, right, we put our FSP and we put our other site system out here in the DMZ. Like I talked about way earlier, the FSP itself will still talk over port 80, so we still do need that port because it won't talk HTTPS, like we said, then it's not a fallback. If it's talking HTTPS, it's not a fallback way of the client saying, hey, I can't talk HTTPS. You get to those nice chicken and the egg. So that actually has to be another site system. Super small traffic, totally one way. Actually, I guess I should change that arrow one of these days. The client to the FSP only. There's nothing that ever goes back because it's literally just an XML blob that the client dumps on that system that gives that status information. And so it can be a pizza box. It can be sitting on another web server that you happen to have sitting out there, something that's totally isolated, and of course secured in and of itself. And then our other site system, which could be multiple depending upon how many clients you have, but most folks will only end up having the one there. I think the arrows just changed. So you can actually change the site server so that it is only communicating out to those DMZ systems. It just depends, once again, on how Nazi-ish your folks that are controlling the firewalls are. So that normally you're always going to allow things from the higher security zone, so your internal, to the less secure zone, which is in your DMZ. You're not going to always allow things that are coming back. So the MP is always going to come back and query the database. So you're actually always going to need that one. So there actually should be another little arrow there. So that's going to be on port 1433 by default. So there's different ways of doing it, and really what this is showing is the site server can always go and tell the other site systems, hey, here's what's going on, except for the MP to database traffic. So it's just a way of controlling all of that traffic going into the DMZ. And that's just a checkbox. We can replace that front end there with a reverse proxy. Same type of thing, but just going into the DMZ. We can move the database into the DMZ. We're not really move. At this point, we're creating a SQL replica. Right? A lot of people do SQL replicas for load bound or for offloading the traffic. So now our MP doesn't have to come back to the site system. Our MP can just query there. But now we have SQL replication going on between those two systems. The main reason to do this is because a lot of firewall guys don't like seeing all that traffic going back and forth, right? Firewall guys, just like the networking guys, it's their firewall. They don't want you using their firewall. So if you want to minimize that traffic to just the replication between the databases, then you can put the SQL replica out there. So at the end of the day, this is all IIS. This is all web traffic. So when you're talking to your security guys, the network guys, the load balancing guys, this is all just HTTP, HTTPS traffic, just like you were hosting a website in your DMZ. So all of those discussions are still 100% applicable, still pertinent, and they should be identical. Right? No one should ever be able to throw you off. Just tell them this is just like a web browser coming into an IIS or any other web server in my DMZ. All those discussions are exactly the same thing. And the same thing, right? Our pass-through versus our actual bridging. This is another fun slide that has to kind of do with that. So if we're putting stuff in our DMZ, a lot of folks will have a separate forest in the DMZ. At that point in time, authentication gets really fun. So if you have just a single forest that spans your internal and your DMZ, no big deal. We don't have to worry about authentication. The same accounts can actually be used. But if we have different forests, now we have to account for different accounts that are going to be there. So the number one is for our installation. We have to do installation at some point to that site system from our site server. Hopefully we've all done this at least once. But now since we're going cross-forest, we have to actually specify an account. We can't use the default account from the site server itself, right? We have to specify that. Number two is for that site system, if it's a management point, to actually be able to get out to the DB. So there's an MP connection account that we can specify. There was a bug in a KB early on when sometimes that would actually fall back to your installation account and of course fail because it didn't have permissions on the database. I think that's been fixed somewhere along the line like in R2 because I haven't seen that happen. I've never seen it happen, so I don't even, the KB was like, it could happen, one of those type of things. So, and it had a workaround in it. And then last is going back from the site system to the site server. Now that one will use either the installation account or the computer's AD account. So if you have trusts maybe going in one way, then you could still use some of the accounts. So it could be easy or it could be really complex just depending upon the trusts that you have in place. And just know that you can specify, and we'll look at a couple of these accounts in a second, you can specify the different accounts that are actually there. You just have to plan for having these extra effectively service accounts that are doing these things. Okay, for the 3 client modes, so similar to that drop down, right, we had intranet only. We have intranet or internet. Now this is really the only interesting one, right? So this is a client that's going to roam. He's going to potentially be on the internet sometimes, and he's going to be potentially internal. So how does he know which of those zones he's going to be in? He's going to try to do an Active Directory global catalog query. If he can successfully perform that query, then he's going to consider himself intranet. And if he can't, then he's going to consider himself internet. Pretty simple. It's not a ping or anything like that. It's simply that AD global catalog query. And then we have our internet only. So the interesting thing here is that you can't flip a client to internet only. You must install them as internet only from the get-go. And that's what that CCM always INF switch is for, or really property for CCM setup. You also need to specify which management point he's going to go to. That's the CCM host name, so that he always goes back to that management point. And then you always want to do the site code also. There's more possible switches, but this is the minimal set of switches when you do a manual installation so that he is internet only. Now, previous to R2, you also had to specify the CCM host name on the command line for a client that could be internet or intranet, so we could roam between the two. As of R2, though, the clients will actually pull that out of Active Directory, so you don't have to worry about that one. So it's effectively, if you implement HTTPS after the fact, previously, the only supported way, you could actually go in and put it in the registry, but it wasn't supported to do it. But by the book, you had to actually reinstall the client so that you could specify CCM host name. Now, as of R2, it'll actually pick that up from the policy. So pretty seamless to actually do, and I've actually done that one, so makes life pretty easy. So the only real special case here is the internet only, right? Those sales guys. So that way, they'll never even try to look for anything internal. the end of the day, you could leave those sales guys as internet, but now they're doing queries for internal servers, right? Some of your security guys aren't going to like that when those queries are going out to public DNS servers for your internal systems, because now some of that gets exposed. And I guarantee you pen testers will pick up on that kind of stuff. Now you got names out there, and those are those seeds that pen testers and of course the really bad guys can start growing into figuring out what's going on in your network and exploiting things. The site system roles, we looked at all these, right? We have our HTTP, HTTPS. It's really kind of 4 here because we have our HTTP, right? Which is kind of a different way. So we looked at all those. Nothing special there, but know that these are all either ors, or they're all mutually exclusive, right? You can't have 2 of these at the same time. Okay, we talked about the krill a lot already, so I don't have to explain a lot of this, but this is starting to go a little more deep dive into the krill. This is a big missing link for a lot of folks, particularly during operating system deployment. And the reason I say that and the reason that happens is because remember I said in my setup on my certificate authority, I didn't have LDAP as the first certificate revocation list distribution point, the krill DP. I didn't have that listed first. By default, when you set up a Microsoft PKI, LDAP is first, so it's Active Directory, right? Our clients have to get to Active Directory to do that. Well, obviously Macs aren't going to be able to do that. Even if they're joined to the domain, I'm not sure if they can actually do that. I can't say I've ever tried that, but I'm assuming that they can. But most people don't necessarily join their Macs to the domain. I haven't done a lot of Mac administration either, so I don't know for sure. Workgroup clients definitely know, right? They're not going to be able to get to our LDAP because obviously they're not in Active Directory. They're not going to have the authentication method available to them to be able to do that. Same with Linux systems, right? Any other systems that really can't get to Active Directory. So that's the number one reason I move LDAP, and a lot of times I won't even put LDAP. There's no reason to put LDAP. It's just a file, as long as we can get to an HTTP location. So I have SMB listed. Most people will tell you don't ever do SMB, because SMB in itself requires an additional authentication, right? So if I have a workgroup client that all of a sudden trying to go to SMB, he's not going to be able to do that either for the same reason he can't get to Active Directory. So HTTP is the way to go. It's the one to put first. The other reason to put it first is the clients are supposed to go down the list of CDPs. They can't get to the first one, they're supposed to get to the next one. They can't get to that one, so on down the line. Well, I've seen in Windows PE, and this is just from observation, and this is what I think kills most people during operating system deployment, is if you put LDAP first, it won't actually go to the next one on the list in Windows PE. Bug in Windows PE, I don't know. There's something wrong with Windows PE. So if you put LDAP in there and you have krill checking enabled, in Windows PE, it's going to die. It's not going to be able to do that. It's going to say, I can't get to the certificate distribution list, which is effectively the same thing as that certificate being blocked, and it's going to die at that point in time. So always make sure HTTP is first in the certificate revocation list. The trick, or in the CDP, the trick there, though, is remember we said, and I showed you, that the certificate revocation list distribution points are hard-coded in the certificates. So if you've already issued all your certificates, there's no way for you to change that. You have to revoke all those certificates and reissue them all. So lots of proper planning comes with your PKI. Like I said, I think this is the missing link. This is why you'll see a handful of blog posts outside there. Just a recap of most of the things I said. You'll see a handful of blog posts out there. Justin actually has one. Xiaofan has one out there. I think Kim has one out there, Opal Fence, on workarounds, because there's a couple things you can do. There's a, and it's one of my next slides, there's a property you can put for CCM setup that tells CCM setup to bypass the krill check and only CCM setup. It's totally unsupported though. But I guess for build and capture in particular, because build and capture never ever is outside of a work group, right? Why you'll see that fail and why you'll see people have blog posts out there talking about using build and capture in an HTTPS environment or native mode going back to 2007. And they're having failures and doing all these workarounds. This is the reason that I think they're all failing, because I've never actually had an issue, except for the very first time I did it when I discovered that WinPE issue. So always make sure the HTTP is the first one in your certificate revocation list.
Would that WinPE issue be because there's no native Active Directory driver?
It could be. It's a very good theory. I've never heard anyone pose any theory, but that sounds like a good theory.
Because we and Johan does the driver, we inject it every time because we do 80 lookups and stuff.
That's a good theory to test out. Actually, that's a good one. So what Dustin said is right. By default, WinPE doesn't have the Active Directory module in it. And so it makes sense that it would never be able to do LDAP. So the real bug there is that it doesn't fall back to the second CDP, though, like it's supposed to.
Right.
But if you inject it, maybe it will work. Could be. Still, just use HTTP. It makes life easier. It's just a website. The other advantage, and really, I guess I'm remiss and I didn't mention it, because the big deal here is your internet-based clients. They're not going to get to LDAP even anything like that, because you're not going to expose your LDAP to the internet unless you really, really want the Russian mob to take over everything that you have. So at that point, you have to expose HTTP. That's the best way to do it. So that's always, just have the first one. You have a name that's exposed internally and externally. It can be two different web servers, right? It's just that file we have to copy between the two. So we can set up whatever automation we want to copy that file between the two. And as long as the client can hit that URL, then he's going to be happy and he's going to happily get that curl. Or just turn curl checking off. Once again, if this is simply a means to an end, if all we're doing is enabling IBCM, is turning curl checking off a bad thing? Probably not. One thing though, most PKIs end up growing into doing more than just ConfigMgr, because you'll set it up, it'll be working, someone else will come in and say, do you have a PKI? Oh yeah, we have a PKI for this. And it starts issuing other certificates, right? PKI by default will issue, if you don't set it up correctly, will issue domain controllers automatically certificates. They will issue EFS certificates if you don't prevent that from happening. So you do a default PKI install, next, you're going to have these things happen automatically in your environment, which both of those are not good things to happen necessarily. The domain controller one, not such a bad thing. Your domain controllers will all start speaking LDAP-S right off the bat, which may freak your domain, your AD guys out. Not necessarily such a bad thing. They'll still listen on LDAP, so it's kind of a good thing in a way, but obviously you've done something to their domain controllers that they probably don't like. But the second one, the EFS thing, can be a bigger thing, right? You'll all of a sudden see all these EFS certificates start popping up anytime anyone tried to do EFS, and if you haven't set up the recovery agent, you're never going to unencrypt those files. Not a good thing. Of course, they can still do that today, but it's not necessarily, with that in place, you're probably going to get blamed for it because you have those certificates
They
there.
can still do it with a locally signed cert and then nobody can help.
Yep, that's right. Turn off EFS if you haven't done it in your environment. I've never seen anyone actually use it. There you go. Do you? Okay, you're an exception.
We're getting rid of it.
Exactly for that reason, right? There was on one of the internal threads recently, there was, it was an interesting follow events. So they were doing OSD. This one company, I don't know who it was, they didn't identify who it was. They saved off the user state for, it was a high level, it was like a senior vice president, executive level salesperson. It had an issue and couldn't be restored. Well, hopefully everyone knows, right, the encryption key when you do stuff to an SMP is stored in the computer association. Great, we can always go grab it out of there. We can run the manual command line to get that data back if we have to. Well, right at about the same time, they had an issue on their site system or their site server database, and it crashed. And so they actually had to do a restore to a previous version that didn't have that computer association in it. So key gone. Person's encrypted files, OSD didn't restore them. Person's encrypted files had, based upon the thread, millions of dollars worth of sales pending in it. They opened a case with CSS, and CSS went, I don't know, there's, whatever, we can't do anything for you, right? It's encrypted. And so my answer on the thread, tongue-in-cheek, of course, probably wasn't appreciated, but was go to the NSA. They could probably help you out because they're about the only ones who are going to have the ability to help you out at that point. So, yeah. So that pertains to that whole EFS discussion, right? Microsoft's not going to help you because they can't. They've explicitly built those kind of things. Now, I say that being an outsider too, right? Maybe the guys actually coding it got some under the table money from the NSA, and maybe the NSA does have a backdoor. Wouldn't be the first product the NSA actually has an explicit backdoor into. But once again, you're still going to have to go to the NSA for help, and I don't think you're going to get any help from them. So.
We'd like to issue a subpoena on our own stuff.
Have you seen the Dilbert cartoon?
Yeah.
There was a Dilbert cartoon, I don't know, maybe a year ago, where the servers at whatever company Dilbert works at crashed, and they lost a bunch of data. And so, of course, Dilbert got blamed for it, and the boss comes around. He's like, what are you doing? I'm hacking the NSA to get our data back. So he hacked the NSA, got their data back, and then the NSA came to arrest him, and he's like, wait, you're arresting me for stealing the data that you stole from us? It doesn't make sense. So. It's the same scenario, right? Okay, so there actually is another way to do krill distribution points or to check the krill. It's called the OCSP responder. OCSP, wait. It's on there. There you go. Online Certificate Status Protocol. It's effectively a proxy, and this is a per system configuration. So instead of the system looking in the certificate for the hard-coded CDP when it goes to validate that certificate, the system will look at its own policy and say, oh, for that certificate, I need to go to my OSP responder. It's really an OSP responder proxy. And he, in turn, will go check the CRIL for me, or the CRIL distribution point that's published for me. So it's a way around those hard codings in the certificates themselves. Macs support this, Windows support this. It's also a better load balancer because now I don't actually have to download that whole CRIL. I'm just going here, the OCSP responder just gives me basically a thumbs up, thumbs down. So if you have a larger CRIL, there's a lot of niceties to have around this. Very few people do this though, but it is a possible way around it, so it is worth mentioning. I think Windows PE will support this also, but I have no idea how to set the OCSP responder. It's probably just a registry value though. Can't say I've ever done it. So, but it is a possibility if you're starting to get into some of those kind of sticky wickets, if you will. Okay, kind of some new stuff for IBCM in general for 2012. And I actually had a better build slide for MMS, so we'll just have to go talk through these because there's actually really, we still have a normal distribution point in here, so just pretend there's a normal distribution point, right? That's for all of our normal content. We still have our update catalog, which always must come from WSUS, wherever that's our on-prem WSUS, whether that's the client internet-facing one or our internal one, that's always got to come from WSUS. We always need policy. That's always either an internal one or an internet-facing one. So those are givens, right? We always need those kind of things. So the two new things really are we can put a cloud DP out there for IBCM potentially. We still need our MP, right? But we can put the cloud DP out there. Now we don't have to put DPs into our DMZ. We don't have to waste all of our bandwidth, right? We all know the MPs themselves don't actually use a lot of bandwidth in general. It's really the content. So if we're willing to pay for that content from Azure instead of on our pipe, now we effectively have a highly available way of delivering that content to all of our clients. Has anyone thought about doing an Azure DP at all? You guys have. So it kind of makes sense. I've heard of a few folks actually looking at them. I haven't actually done one myself outside of a lab and just toyed around with it. So as the Azure prices have gone down, 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 and storage is dirt cheap in Azure now, you're really just paying for egress, right? I think you can get like, I don't even know what it is. It's gigs and gigs and gigs for like pennies a month. So storage is dirt cheap. It's just data that's coming out of there. So if you just have some far-flung clients wherever that can reliably get to your MP, your internet-facing MP, but you know, them downloading Office or something like that, you just don't want to happen to your DMZ. Or maybe you don't even want to put a DP in your DMZ. Supposing the policy's fine, but now you've got less infrastructure and less headaches to worry about if you don't put the DP out there. Put it up in Azure, and then all that content will come down from there. And so the last piece here is we have our software updates. So interestingly, software updates for IBCM clients will actually go to Microsoft Update first. Remember, we're still getting our catalog from WSUS. We always have to get our catalog from our instance of WSUS. But the software updates themselves, the binaries, will by default get them from Microsoft Update. Right? So same binaries. They're both signed the exact same way, whether we're delivering them from our distribution point or our cloud distribution point. Actually, won't come from the cloud distribution point. That's a whole other story. But whether it's getting it from our on-prem distribution point or Microsoft, it's the exact same binary. So who cares really where it downloads it from? And if it's downloading it from Microsoft, then it's not taxing my DP in the DMZ, which is definitely a good thing. But it is content only, right? That's what that asterisk is there for. Unfortunately, if you're using a third-party provider like Secunia or someone like that to provide third-party updates, the third-party updates won't come from a cloud DP and they won't come from Microsoft, of course. So you still have to put a DP out there if you're doing third-party updates. All kinds of weird little caveats to some of these things. I guess they're things that they didn't think about that people like Kent run into as he's doing implementations, and they just kind of go like this. So next version, VNext. We're all looking forward to it, right, Greg? Okay, common discussion, IBCM, VPN, direct access. Anyone doing direct access? A couple of y'all like it here in general? Pretty good. So in general, it's going to be a lot better than IBCM. You don't have the PKI requirements if you're doing 2012 R2. Right? At that point, it'll use Kerberos. Your machines have to be domain joined, but you don't have to worry about getting the certificates out to all of your clients. Of course, it's always on, so you're going to be using it for other applications, or you can use it for other applications. You won't use it for Link typically. Link still needs to go through its normal path, although they're supposed to fix that in the next version of Link, I think. You typically don't want to get email this way because, once again, Exchange kind of handles that by itself with RPC over HTTPS. But for all of your other applications, anything internal, it's a great way to expose those to the users without the user ever having to do anything, right? It's always on. So they don't, as long as they have connectivity to the internet, they're going to be able to get that access. VPNs, they still work, still traditional, so you can do that, but it's not the always-on experience. You're not going to necessarily be able to push updates to people. You're going to have to wait for them to connect to the VPN. So the VPN is kind of the low-man totem pole. It'll still work, but it's not the greatest thing in the world. If your networking guys don't want to do direct access, that's really the big problem here, right? Is you've got to get the networking guys on board because this is really their domain in most organizations. And most networking guys, it says Microsoft, and all they're going to do is, right, they're going to roll their eyes and walk away and you know, say their normal Microsoft things. So that's really the big fight there. So at that point, you may have to go to IBCM, which works great, but it's only ConfigMgr. So it just depends upon what you need to have in your environment. There's some additional infrastructure to stand up for IBCM. Like you said, we got to put those site systems up. Maybe you're putting a reverse proxy up. Maybe you're going to Cloud DB. Maybe you're doing some of those other pieces also. So you always got to worry about a little bit of extra overhead. And of course, you got to have your PKI in place, right? None of those are there for direct access. You do have to have an edge server for direct access, and there's a little bit of infrastructure around it, but it gives you a lot more bang for the buck at the end of the day. So if you can get it done, direct access is definitely the way to go. If your networking guys are going to fight you tooth and nail, then you have to try to fall back to IBCM. And of course, if nobody wants to do that, you can still rely on good old VPN, but you're not going to be able to get most of the things in a reliable fashion, right? Because who knows when the users are actually going to connect, and if they're going to stay connected while those updates are downloading. Okay, I think this is the last slide. So this is, I guess, for any of you who are ConfigMgr admins, I've said ConfigMgr a lot, but how much did I really talk about ConfigMgr? We were obviously in the console a little bit, right? Yeah, you know, we saw a few little switches. There weren't very many switches, right? There was just a few little things there. So you got to learn IIS. There's the bindings we saw in IIS, actually putting the certificates in there. There's obviously a ton of PKI, and we went off into PKI a lot more than I had in my sessions before that I've done this specific one. But a lot of it was just PKI, right? HTTP, it's web stuff. You know, like I said, it was the IIS stuff. You got to know that kind of stuff. There's all these things. You got to know about the traffic that's happening. All of these things are totally outside of ConfigMgr itself, which for me is always the fun of ConfigMgr because I got to know a lot of other things that I like doing. Alluded to this one. We've talked a lot of PKI, right? The concepts in and of themselves, once you've read them, once you've lived them, and once you've experienced them, they're not difficult. They're pretty straightforward. They make sense. But if you've not heard some of these things, you've not even, you know, I start talking private keys and those kind of things, you know, and CRILs and the CDPs. There's a lot of different little distinct concepts that have nothing to do with anything else that we do. And if you're not familiar with those things, you're going to screw them up really easily. And so that's why it's not easy. Yep, we talked about that one. Yep, we talked about that one. We kind of talked about that one. So one of the other things, and the reason the client auth certs need to be unique is because it defines the identity of the client. Right? So what's the easiest way to get a client to generate a new GUID? You delete the client auth certificate and it'll regenerate the GUID. Or in HTTPS, we can actually move that client auth certificate to another client and they will actually generate the exact same GUID. So there's a time when this happens. So in our name clash CAS, our Exchange CAS, our client access server, the CASs need certificates. So most folks will issue a certificate to their CASs per the documentation on TechNet. Well, what does that do? It actually issues a certificate that has both server auth, which is what they really need, and client auth in there. That certificate will be identical because the CASs actually have the same name to the clients. So they need to have the same certificate. But now it has a client auth certificate that's identical on both of them. You put the ConfigMgr agent on there and it generates the same GUID on both of them. Easy workaround, don't put the client auth purpose within your certificates on the CASs, and then they'll generate their own GUIDs. So it really highlights that this is the identity for that client. Even those self-signed certificates define the identity for those clients, which we didn't look at. We'll look at that real quick here in a second. And there's that CCM HTTP state. That's the property on CCM setup we talked about that can change the mode of CCM setup itself. Bad, undocumented. So, and the reason I say it's really bad here, because when this came up on an internal DL, one of the guys on the product team chastised the guy for even mentioning this in a blog post and said, you know, these things are subject to change and we're tweaking these things all the time. So that's sometimes when you see these kind of undocumented things, my statement always, do something undocumented, you're probably going to get undocumented results, and or unsupported things, right? If you do unsupported things, you're going to get unsupported results, kind of the same type of thing. And this definitely falls into this category, right? They don't expect people to use this, so they will change it, in a heartbeat. And if you're using it now, you're toast at that point in time. Okay, let's hop to the client real quick. We still good on time? Have I bored anybody? Okay. Have I bored anybody? Okay. Let's hop to one of those clients. There's a couple things I said I was going to show you. So here's my non-HTTPS client. Well, first we can see in the control panel too, right off the bat. You guys may or may not have seen this, right? We do have our self-signed right there. So it does have that client certificate, and of course he's currently intranet. If we go over to my other client, similar thing, except of course he has a PKI client certificate. And where we find those certificates is in the MMC. We go to certificates, always computer account like we were talking about. Have to have local admin privileges to be able to put a certificate here. And it creates this special SMS store down here. And it actually creates 2 certificates. And notice their expiration dates. It's 99 years. No idea why they picked 99, but this is the way it's always been. Hopefully, well, I don't know about hopefully, but none of us will be around in 99 years. So if this system is still in use in 99 years, God help the people who are maintaining it at the time. So. But these define identity, right? If I delete these, restart my client agent, it will regenerate new certificates, which of course means a new GUID, and it means a new resource ID in ConfigMgr too at the end of the day. So now, ConfigMgr 2012 is smart enough to use the SID, so I'm still joined to the domain. It will use the SID from Active Directory to match those resources up. So we're not going to have the duplicate resources like we did in ConfigMgr. Behind the scenes, it will actually, I think, generate a new one, but it will merge them together. So you won't have some of those duplicate issues. So that's a new thing they added to 2012 way back. So hopefully you guys aren't seeing a whole lot of duplicate resources anymore.
Part of the discovery.
The SID comes in as part of the discovery, yeah. It always did before, it was just never visible. You could never query it. There was a bug on that one in 2007. That was one that I filed a long time ago. So, but that's all about identity. So we can actually come in when we go into the console. Let me look at my assets here. So for Win7.1, we can do the block. And like we talked about before, for the boot image certificate, this is the exact same thing. It will block that certificate for that client agent. That's how I'm doing it. So if I gen a new client certificate on that client, it won't be blocked anymore because it's all based upon the client. So this is, and the whole point behind them using certificates here is so that they can do this. So this is identical to this certificate being listed in the certificate revocation list on the PKI side. It does the exact same thing ultimately in ConfigMgr. It's just coming from a little bit of a different place. So that's I mean, you don't have to know those nuts and bolts, but it is a nice to know thing at the end of the day. We can do the block here too. This is the client that actually has the certificate. So we can block it here, or of course that certificate we can block on the PKI side and get the same effective thing. It's blocked in a little bit of a different place, but we're still going to prevent that client from communicating. We can do HTTPS. This is my one and only Unix server. We can do HTTPS on Unix, but I haven't done that, so I don't know the pain there. Probably a lot of the same type of things. So if that's in your environment, we can absolutely do that also. Yeah, it's CentOS. That's why I called it Penny One. Yes, I didn't have a better name at that time. So, I think that was all the things I said I was going to show you. Was there anything else that I said that I missed? There's a couple of times I said I'll show you in a minute, so I think I captured everything. Okay, everyone an expert now? Any other questions? Go ahead.
So if you are using HTTPS, then you're not using a self-signed certificate?
For the clients themselves, correct.
So because you're going to distribute out a certificate to each client.
Correct.
Your PKI.
Correct.
And so does that right-click option still exist?
For the block?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is my HTTPS client right there, and so it is there. Yep, it's there. Yep.
That's not going to like modify that krill.
The krill, no, but it is kind of the same effective thing. It's blocked in a little bit of a different place, but it is ultimately blocking the certificate itself because that is defining the identity of that client. Yeah, we have, of course, the big ribbon bar up here.
What are some of the reasons why you would want to block
It's all about rogue. It's all about being rogue and having something rogue in your environment. So kind of like with the site code, one of the interesting stories, and I was talking to Dave, David James. I don't know, you guys, David James is the lead developer on ConfigMgr and has been for like 10 years. He's been part of the product team for like 20 years. I was talking to him in Minnesota, and he said there was a case of one of the developers going to Starbucks. Starbucks happened to be using the same site code for their site as Microsoft was internally. And so his client, and this was way early on too, this was like 2.0 time frame. So his client actually started reporting to the Starbucks site because it had the same site code. Now that all related to the trusted root key. So notice I never said trusted root key all day today because that has nothing to do with PKI. It has nothing to do with anything that we talked about today. So if someone says trusted root key, revoke, issue, those kind of things, totally separate conversation. But that's where it comes from. So it's about being able to control those rogue entities in your environment or potentially accidental things. Is it a real thing? No, not necessarily. But if they don't give you the option to do it, you know there's someone out there who's going to be like, well, how can I block XYZ, right? We fired so-and-so. I guess in the BYOD world, right? We blocked them. We don't want them to get our copy of Office anymore, right, that we just put out there with the Office key. You have to have a way of being able to block things out
They're
there.
out there, they're rogue, and you can't get a hold of them.
Exactly.
And you don't want them to do communication.
Yeah, it could be the decibel test type thing too. Hey, look, here's this client. We're not sure who it is. We want to make sure they're not getting our super secret software because we're Boeing and we're doing NASA work, etc. We're just going to block them. And it's the decibel test. When they call in, we know who it is at that point in time, right? So that's a valid way to do things too. So yeah, at the end of the day, you have to give people a way to be able to take those permissions away and to be able to block those kind of things.
Just removing the client record doesn't do it.
Correct. Yeah. So Dustin brings up a good point, right? If I delete the resource from the console, that actually doesn't delete the client agent in any way. In SMS 2003, I think that's when they took it out, right, Greg? If you deleted it after 14 days, the client agent would remove itself, something like that. I don't remember the details anymore, but they don't do that anymore. There's no cleanup. So as soon as that client tried to report back in, ConfigMgr would just simply create a new resource for it. So that's not blocking in any way. You need to have some explicit method of saying, no, get out of here, kick the dog, if you will.
So the Starbucks guy, did he go back to the office and write that Site 4C?
The trusted key stuff, or
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah, right, because originally with early on it was, it'll just find its site, get stuff moving all over, and then they came out with this, here's this way to force this.
Yep. I'm sure it led to all that. There's some really interesting stories. The other one, were you there, Greg, when David was telling us about the guys in suits that showed up one day? So if we all remember back to ConfigMgr 2007, pre-SP1, I think, there was a 2-minute delay from when a client downloaded a policy to when it actually evaluated that policy and started acting upon it. I don't know if you all remember that, but it was there. The reason that was there, and this is a David James story once again, is they were all sitting around coding one day, and 2 guys dressed to the hilt in black suits showed up and said, Bill Gates' computer is slow. And they were all like, okay. So they went and looked at it, and because at startup time, the policies would download on Bill Gates' computer and start doing things, and he didn't like that. So they put the 2-minute delay in. So you've got all these interesting little stories like that of why things are like they are. So I'm sure when you've been at Microsoft for long enough, you've got some interesting stories. And if Bill said it, you jump, right? So. Okay, any other HTTPS fun questions? Yep.
Auto enrollment max.
Sorry, what was it? Auto enroll?
Enrollment max.
Oh, okay. That's a piece I haven't done enough of. So that changed also in R2 and how there's a little utility they include from the Mac that you run, and it will automatically go request the certificate for you. But I don't remember all the details on that.
Yeah, you could pass through a username,
Yeah.
password, using plain text, so they removed it, and now you actually have to manually set it every.
Right. Yeah, because it's a user-based certificate on the Mac. So some of the things I was talking about as far as on the Windows side, where it's a computer-based certificate, that's not applicable on the Mac because everything is user-based on the Macintosh side. So things get weird. There was one thing that I read the other day where if the username on the Mac has a space in it, the certificate generation dies also. So there's all kinds of little idiosyncrasies when you get off of Windows, right? Because they just haven't been doing the Mac stuff long enough either. So the folks, I mean, Chris Knackers has done a few webcasts and that on the Mac OS X side. So if you're going down that route, I encourage you to go find some of his stuff. And Peter Dahlman's has done some also, so he would be another one. And I know his stuff got recorded at PyTech at Europe. Him and James Bannon, right, probably did a Mac one, and James Bannon's done some Mac stuff over the years too. So that's definitely one of those places. Go do some research before you do it, because it's not something commonly done. And that kind of the similar statement, do unsupported things, will do uncommon things and get uncommon results. It's kind of the same type of thing there too. It's just not a whole lot of people have done it. And so you don't necessarily know if you're getting what's expected at that time. So go see what other people have done and try to mirror what they've done at times. All righty. Any other questions?
Great.
Good deal. Thanks, guys.
Let's take a few minute break. We'll come back at 1:45. It's about a little less than 10 minutes. And we'll have Greg come up and do his recaps. So it should be in 9 minutes.